Stan Jabalisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1GV Whiskey. 1. Good vibrations. I'd like to ask you a question, so I'm going to leave comments open. Below 30 kilohertz is an entirely unknown realm, at least essentially entirely unknown to ham radio operators, but it exists nevertheless. Just as there is no upper limit to frequency, there is no upper limit to wavelength in the electromagnetic spectrum. Wavelengths can get to be kilometers, even light years long, and still legitimate waves and legitimate radiation can exist in intergalactic space at those wavelengths. The problem is we don't hear them here on Earth because, first of all, the ionosphere blocks them. And second of all, our own human-made noise just simply obliterates all such signals. But maybe someday the proverbial poo-poo will hit the propeller and the Earth will suddenly be deprived of all human-made noise. And somehow or another, we will be able to hear, at least communicate, at these wavelengths using the ionosphere, which essentially reflects at all wavelengths below 30 kilohertz, just as if it were a 100% reflector. We'll be able to communicate at 30 kilohertz, 3 kilohertz, 300 hertz, 30 hertz. And of course, speeds will have to get rather slow when you get below that. But a long time ago, I built a very low frequency VLF converter, contrived it using my Drake R4A and T4X. I made a video about that somewhere in my roster, but I can't for the life of me direct you to it. But you can well imagine that VLF converters for the range of 3 to 30 kilohertz, VLF meaning very low frequency, can certainly be made. They would have to be digital modes. Voice is impractical at such wavelengths. And even below 3 kilohertz, you can hear things if there's no human-made noise. If you've ever been out in the middle of the ocean, for example, and used battery-powered equipment, maybe you've been able to contrive something like this, although I'll bet the number of people in the world who've done that are few and far between. You probably count them on one paw. Nevertheless, I'd like to know if you've ever attempted to listen to the spectrum below 30 kilohertz, because I have heard signals all the way down to about 10 kilohertz where the human-made noise level gets overwhelming. I've heard what sounds like radio teletype frequency shift or phase shift keying all the way down to 13 kilohertz. I've heard various other signals all the way up to 30 kilohertz, and of course above that, I believe I've heard WWVL at 60 kilohertz. I don't know if that still exists or not. It was a long time ago. But it's fun to think about those frequencies and wavelengths. The same formulas apply for conversion to frequency versus wavelength as at any other part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So ham radio operators don't have any allocations that low, although we do now, I believe, have allocations in the 150 or 160 kilohertz range. I haven't paid very much attention to it, because I just haven't had the time to spend researching it, and I certainly don't have the space to erect any kind of decent antenna for it. But nevertheless, uh, the allocations are there. You have to get special permissions to use some of them if you want to transmit. And I don't know what kind of regulations govern transmission below 10 or 9 or 10 kilohertz, but there, I think, frequencies below a certain limit are unallocated. I think it's 9 or 10 kilohertz. These are all things I remember from long ago, but what vividly strikes my memory is the signals that I did hear, all the way down as low as 13 kilohertz with a VLF converter. And of course, there's ULF, ultra low frequency, and then you can use the same prefixes going on down, down, down in frequency, up, up, up in wavelength. And someday, when humans traverse intergalactic space, perhaps we'll no longer have ionospheric restrictions and we'll be able to communicate on any frequencies we want. It ought to be a fascinating time. And I think there are beings on other worlds watching us, wondering, will this race make it? Will this race be one of those, the human race, one of those who can someday join us in the intergalactic community? They're not ready yet. They're too busy with trivia and fighting amongst each other. But perhaps there's hope. We'll just wait a little longer, and a little longer, and a little longer yet, because we have time, they say. Out there in intergalactic space, we have time. Stan Gibilisco speculating wildly on this. What day is it? The 16th of October, 2018. On behalf of Ham Radio 73 and So Long, which, regardless of frequency or wavelength, will always be transmittable as da-da-da-da-da-da.